Arabia, which means that they're going to in when they lose.
I can start an email chain. I think I already have everyone's emails, so I think I'm good. I just sent the emails out. Tell me if you don't get them.
Did everybody get the email chain? Okay. Okay, everybody's good, right? Cool. We affirm our sole condition is the 21st century Jim Crow. Davies explains that through the secret NSA program Marina, automatic summaries of individuals can be generated. He argues that NSA is hoarding vast quantities of metadata about millions of internet users, piercing together the records of their social networking uses, locations, and other personal details. The year-long records of user data is gathered as part of a clandestine program called Marina. It uses browser tracking and buildup of automatic summaries of pattern life activity and movements. The Marina is seen by SIGINT and collection systems, and the NSA was building complex models on U.S. citizens through a combination of metadata crunching and adding in less regulated third-party information. Marina's strength for law enforcement agencies and homeland security is in the breadth of its information. Cagliari indicates that this data is part of day-to-day law enforcement practices as it is acceptance of usage NSA material for domestic and traditional law enforcement purposes. The algorithmic technologies embedded in police have created 21st century Jim Crow, as who argues that ebbed in the structure of policing into the state in much of the same way that Jim Crow ebbed in racial classifications. It says your body is subject to invasion, while courts excuse a violation of your rights. You are the subject of a carceral state just waiting to be cataloged. There are two impacts to 21st century Jim Crow. First is the NSA law enforcement relationships mean data is used in routine policing duties. As Balco explains, that the information that NSA collects will be used by police to lock up ordinary Americans for routine crimes. The feds had these arguments with police agencies all over the country, affecting thousands of cases. In fact, O'Donnell argued in 2019 that algorithms create feedback loops whereby predictive policing becomes more virulent in its racial bias over time. Predictive policing algorithms predispose police to collect more crime from one region than the the other, but police presence in Black communities is inherently deadly, as the Washington Post concludes after a 6-year study on fatal shootings they found in 2015 that there have been more than 5,000 such shootings. Despite the unpredictable events that lead to fatal shootings, police killed almost the same number of people annually, nearly 1,000. And second is pattern of life analysis uniquely targets peaceful protests. As Diaz wrote in 2020 that the surveillance of social media is a growing trend. Posts have landed individuals of color in unreliable gang databases and used to justify keeping them in prison. From protests to public housing, social media monitoring raises civil liberties and civil rights concerns that are currently going unaddressed. Unfortunately, access to data allows law enforcement to interrupt Black movements, as FUCN concludes in 2020 that using these technologies, authorities can interrupt organizing efforts and disrupt the peaceful demonstrations before they even begin. They can also identify, track, and even arrest protesters after they return home, and increased surveillance can discourage political expression online. Movements grounded in Blackness are key to create structural change, as Perry argues in 2020 that it was demand through protests that spurred the quicker arrest of police officer for George Floyd's murder and prompted international corporations to invest billions in fighting racism and inequality. The country's rallies must continue if we expect substantive structural change. And juxtapose this with white movements like women's suffrage movement that always excluded Black women, with the civil rights movement that embraced intersectionality. Only a promotion of Blackness can bring visibility to issues that intersect with it. As Murian argued in 2020 that the civil rights movement provided valuable lessons in social justice intersectionality for progressive social justice movements. The civil rights movement utilized social justice intersectionality before it became a buzzword. It engaged in collaborations with women's rights and labor rights movements. Thus, the role of the ballot is that we must look at surveillance through the lens of Blackness. Algorithms always operate under the paradigm of whiteness. Affirming rejects the use of 21st century Jim Crow racial classifications and centralizes discourse of surveillance around Blackness. As Brown finds that algorithms function under a logic of whiteness, this logic privileges users in relation or proximity to Blackness, and rooting the studying of contemporary surveillance through the history of Black enslavement and its attendant practices of captivity open up the possibilities for fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and the productive disruptions that what happened when Blackness enters the frame. And reversing this discourse is vital, as status quo surveillance operates around the threat perception, which justifies continued marginalization of people of color. As Weller concludes that in democracy, there's a form of social contract at work in which balances increased surveillance of citizens with an expectation of state protection. State control of information on citizens under the auspice of their welfare has long been used as a powerful justification for surveillance. In the West, greater media coverage of threats and moral panics in the public sphere paradoxically demand both greater protection through increased state surveillance and at the same time greater liberty through legislation which allows open access to information collections. For these to be urged in an AF ballot. And I can send a speech talk.
Thank you.
I just sent it. Let me know when you get it.
I just got it. The order is going to be counter roll of the ballot at the top, and then I'll go down my case. The counter roll of the ballot is to vote for the team who best improves post-FIAL quality of life outcomes for communities of color. The reason you prefer this is because their model can't resolve ambiguity. Michael Egnoff of Harvard University finds their framing of the debate creates a false choice that will always prove that the principles they advocate for are good in the abstract, like anti-Black surveillance being bad. Adhering to the moral perfectionism of their discourse, however, falls apart when people see how to apply them because things are a lot more complicated and gray in the real world. This leads decision makers to have no way to decide between what decisions to make because of issues fitting into the standard. If in an effort to reject racist surveillance practices, alternatives which make it harder to survive for the Black community occur, this intuitively means that structural racism is concretely affecting Black votes more than before. Thus, the best way to work through this gray area is a counter roll of the ballot. Contention 1 is pandemics. Pandemics will become more prevalent as Preston 20 finds that as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, each new pandemic will be even more devastating than the last, which Davies 20 states could happen every 5 years. Hal 20 writes that U.S. industrial animal agriculture systems create flu strains able to mutate quickly and become more dangerous as they spread. Luckily, we are on the path to preventing another disaster, as Rosenstein 20 finds the COVID-19 pandemic will usher in a permanent and far-reaching suspension of surveillance, warranting that the aftermath of COVID will no doubt convince policymakers that more surveillance will be justified to prevent future pandemics. pandemics. Specifically, Bucky reports that surveillance of mobile phones, satellites, and social media at various stages of the public health response is crucial in order to provide important real-time information about patterns that spread disease. Grieger 20 warns the next pandemic could be 100 times worse with a fatality rate of 1 in 2 unless change occurs. Crucially, the impacts of pandemics disproportionately impact Black people, as Suge 20 finds that they are 3 times as likely as white people to contract COVID, leading to higher death rates. Contention 2 is terrorism. Broad NSA surveillance is crucial in preventing terrorist attacks. Lewis of the CSIS in 2014 corroborates that there is no replacement for surveillance as a law enforcement and intelligence tool. He furthers that NSA's broad surveillance of communications is the least intrusive yet most effective method for discovering terrorist activity. He warns that because terrorist attacks take months or even years to plan, the metadata the NSA collects is the only source of information that can capture plans of an attack. These effects are exacerbated because Bell 17 reports that in the process of spying on foreigners, the NSA could not help but collect large volumes of Americans' communications. Therefore, by ending domestic surveillance, foreign surveillance will also end. The impact is right-wing extremism. Lee 15 reports there is a shifting towards countering right-wing extremism in the counter-terror efforts. This is crucial, as Schuzman 15 finds that white nationalists are the leading source of ideological violence in America. Contention 3 is cyber threats. Mayor 15 finds the NSA is expanding its role in cybersecurity through domestic surveillance. First, by spying and deterring hackers. Nakashima 19 explains that the new NSA Cyber Directorate aims to prevent cyber attacks, which is crucial, as Goldsmith 13 explains that the government needs to collect signals intelligence in order to keep computer and telecommunication networks safe. Second is by developing AI. Corrigan 19 concludes that the NSA is creating AI-powered cyber defense tools. Critically, building those tools requires data. Mass data collection is essential for this, as Corrigan concludes that without the standard pool of information, AI tools will struggle to differentiate between legitimate and suspicious online behavior. The impacts are twofold. The first is economic harms. Borgard 18 explains that destructive attacks against the financial sector could have catastrophic effects on the economy and threaten financial stability. Economic collapses are disastrous, as Oxfam quantifies the economic fallout from the pandemic pushed 500 million people into poverty. Crucially, Clement 20 finds that Black Americans are far more likely to be laid off during an economic collapse than white people. Second is civilian infrastructure. Pry 19 quantifies that a takedown of this grid would kill over 90% of the population. Critically, this would disproportionately impact Black people because of the discriminatory rationing of food and resources. Thus, we are proud to negate.
Can we get a speech log?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you want the cards or just the speech log?
The cards preferably.
Okay.
Thanks.
I just sent it.
Are your roll the ballot cards in the speech doc too?
I don't think so.
Oh, can you send those?
Yeah. I sent it.
Okay, I think I got it. Anthony, did you get it?
Give me a sec to reload this. Yeah, I just got it. Thanks.
Cool. Okay. Are you ready for cross?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about your role of the ballot, right? How is ending domestic surveillance gray? Like, what's the grayness that you guys are talking about on your card?
So we're saying that ending domestic surveillance, like weighing the impacts, like the tangible impacts of that, is less gray than just saying like the role of the ballot is to promote more discourse.
So you're saying that talking about the impacts are more important than actually talking about anti-blackness.
No, so we're saying that when you look at the tangible impacts, it's a lot more clear because like all of like the rhetoric that you use.
What's unclear about
true.
ending domestic surveillance and dismantling a structural racism in America? Like,
No,
what's
so
unclear about that? I'm a little confused.
our argument is that, of course, in theory, your arguments are true, and that argument should be viewed through the lens of Blackness. But the problem is that if you look at all of the tangible impacts of like domestic surveillance and the impacts of domestic surveillance to Black people, then that is more important because those are the tangible impacts at the end of the day.
And we can't talk about the tangible impacts of having a racist NSA system as well that's centered around Blackness. Like, I'm just a little confused with why like that our impacts aren't included in your role of the ballot.
Okay, so that's my question. So under your role of the ballot, what does the neg have to do to win?
You can give an alternative role of the ballot like you did, or you can say the NSA is like not racist, or you can just like generally debate it. What I'm asking is like how are impacts of having a racist NSA against Black people not not under your role of the ballot? Because that is talking about an impact of domestic surveillance, right?
I'm so confused. What are you talking about?
I'm asking about your role of the ballot. I'm saying since your role of the ballot is looking specifically at the impacts of ending a political policy, how is our case not fit into that?
So our argument is that when you talk about the impacts of ending domestic surveillance through the lens of impacting Black people, it's clearer than just like talking about it, which is what your role of the ballot is, since you talk about discourse. So our role of the ballot encompasses yours. So not only do we have like more discourse on our side, we also talk about the tangible impacts of domestic surveillance.
So you just want to expand the conversation to other impacts, basically.
No, specifically impacts to Black people. Just the tangible impacts of domestic surveillance on Black people.
We do the same thing though. I'm just a little confused with how it's different.
So I'm just trying to clarify. So at the end of the day, should the judges be looking at the tangible impacts of this policy or not?
I mean, that's centering the debate around like Blackness. Yes, you can look at the impacts. You look at what it does to Black people. That's our entire case.
Okay, so your entire case is simply that we should look at the tangible impacts of domestic surveillance on Black people.
You should look at surveillance through the lens of Black people to see how it affects them, basically.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. Do you have a question?
I'm still like kind of confused. So what does the neg need to prove under your role of the ballot? So if we don't read a counter role of the ballot, what do we need to prove under yours?
You can just say that like the NSA isn't bad, like NSA isn't bad, or like algorithms are good. Like you can just give other answers to our case, basically. All right.
I think me and Lauren will take a little bit of prep. Give me a sec to open this thing up. Okay. We're gonna start prep now. All right, we're stopping prep. We've used 50 seconds exactly. It's gonna be the role of the ballot in their case. See, sorry, just waiting for like 2 seconds for this to pull up. Okay. Starting the role of the ballot, they say you should only look at post-fiat impacts for people of color. We'll pretty much agree. We say that these thesis of the debate needs to be centered around blackness. If we're going to obviously win the argument that the NSA is uniquely harmful towards black, but the NSA have practices are uniquely harmful, creating a structure of racism, which is always going to outweigh maybe an impact that might affect black people, but not just these structures of racism that still exist in the United States, which is why you're still going to prefer our case, even under this like lens. Like we pretty much have the same framework. There isn't really much of a debate here. Let's go into pandemics. A couple responses. First, on pandemics, ending structural racism outweighs black lives more and matter more than a pandemic. This summer proves your impact calculus dripping in whiteness, as Resnick argues that it's always been stay at home as much as possible, except for essential activities. Processing of police violence is an essential activity for a lot of people. Just as living as a black person is a risk factor for dying at the hands of police. If I'm quiet and I do absolutely nothing, I could die because I exist. Managed Wang is always going to prioritize protecting white people while leaving black people without any structural change, which means you always prefer the But second, their Rosenstein evidence Lee talks about how police would be used to enforce mandate. That's just another link, as Jabali 20 explains that this pandemic amplifies how unjustly police enforce use of their authority. Aggressive policing could become even more normalized with black people, the victims. The status quo leads enforcement of social distancing to the hands of police and built up brutality will do more harm than good to black Americans and the most vulnerable. But third, we tell you the CDC can independently solve. They're expanding health surveillance right now. As the CDC explains last year that the CARES Act provided the CDC with $500 million specifically for public health modernization. Investments have enabled the CDC to take the first step to strengthen health surveillance infrastructure. Surveillance will give faster understanding of emerging threats along with other things. There's two reasons why they solve better than the NSA. A is healthcare data, as the CDC can predict and detect diseases early to prevent them from spreading. The NSA can only use phone data, which is only going to be used to track the diseases after it's already spread. But B is public trust, as Schwartz 20 explains that NSA contact chaining, automated analysis of communication to identify connections. Any blurring of police work with contact tracing can undermine public health, and people are less likely to cooperate with the contact tracing if they feel the consequences. This is specific for black people too, because if black people are too scared to contact trace because they're scared of the police are going to be at the door, they're never actually going to adhere to responses. On their second contention, first, turning the argument, the NSA data collection takes too much that causes overload, as Eddington explains. The quest to collect it all only to accumulation of masses of useless information, making it harder to find the real threats. Mass surveillance is a guarantee of more lethal intelligence failures. The impact of this overload is that the NSA is relying on partnership with local law enforcement to understand and interpret the data. That's Kyle and Balco from KSUG say is uniquely harmful because they actually just use it to target black people, not white supremacists. But second, the discourse of trying to fight white supremacy without actually tackling structural issues and anti-black. Your white rhetoric just fuels white supremacy. This is another link to the role of the ballot, as the win argues that it is this chaotic climate that demands a unforgiving limit to anti-racism. For focusing on individuals acts for white supremacy violence while failing to account to structural inequalities that harm communities of color actively contributes to the reproduction of white supremacy. But third, this discourse of terrorism pushes the conversation further away from the lens of the ballot. Their neg is why we affirm, as Nimerick furthers, that a consequence of decontextualization in terrorist discourse is that when the enemy is constructed as an abstract etiquette and atmosphere of public anxiety and fear, you never actually focus on the real issues. But fourth, their surveillance is just used versus black and brown people. The NSA surveillance does not hold white people accountable because it was built to protect them. As Kumar furthers, that the NSA's mass surveillance is central on the privacy rights of the white middle class. National security surveillance can draw entire communities into this web while reassuring the white middle class that they are not to be troubled. That's why the only example that the NSA actually tried to target white people was when they tried to arrest white people after they already attacked the Capitol. They don't actually ever stop attacks. They just react to attacks while they actually happen, which is why there's never going to be a single example of them actually preemptively stopping white people from actually doing a terrorist attack. On cyber, first, reject these long-standing improbable impacts. High magnitude impacts are always used to justify ignoring the role of black people. That's well. But secondly, you can turn the NSA, decrease NSA roles lead to cybercommand filling, as Bing 18 explains. There's an inherent conflict between cyber and espionage. The partnership is dramatically complicated because each organization is responsible for a unique mission that is drastically different yet requires identical tools and talent, both of which are finite. And cybercommand will use AI as maturity 20 finds that cybercommand is in the process of unifying cyberspace operations. Cybercommand is sending operations overseas to collect data. That AI is key, as Siegel 20 furthers. The AI results in a 100% detection rate. We tell you the cybercommand is uniquely better because unlike the NSA that literally makes vulnerabilities, the cybercom is strictly on defense. But thirdly, you can turn it. Or thirdly, we tell you that on financial markets, black people don't have the same access to financial markets as white people. They can never link into our case because COP finds last year that African Americans are falsely represented when it comes to financial assets. About 30% of black households in the U.S. have retirement accounts because there's 60% of whites. But fourthly, on grids, there's no one's going to attack now, as Louis 18 explains, that Chinese officials are more concerned with China's growth. Russians want confusion, not physical damage. Iran and North Korea use cyber attacks against banks, but the goal is coercion, not destruction. And even if there is a grid attack, it wouldn't be widespread, as Korth 18 furthers that the North American grid is a patchwork of unconnected islands. So taking down one isn't going to take on the whole grid. Hackers wouldn't have control of all the things to an actual blackout, which means it's such an improbable impact. You prefer our case because we actually know we can solve change, where they just have these big impacts that might affect black people. It's not the same. I'll send a speech talk.
Thank you.
No problem. Sorry, I'm just trying to remove some stuff that I didn't read from the actual thing, so that's not confusing. Okay, I should have just sent. It's just in the order of the actual speech.
Got it, thank you. I'll let you know once it gets here. Got it, okay. Also, or actually never mind, I'll just look through the doc. And I'm gonna call Jen, so I'll show him the call starts. Okay. Alright, that was 120. Just gonna write that down. And it's gonna be roll of the ballot, then frontlining, and then their case. Is anybody not ready? Alright. Time. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna just run a few more seconds. Okay, that was another 5. Time starts now. Starting the roll of the ballot, we're both talking about post-fiat implications. However, you have to go past just the structures of racism because they still have to win that the resolution itself is a decrease in racism. Otherwise, they're just asking you to do a symbolic action of affirming, but they're not actually making, or actually they're not getting rid of the bad politics of the school, and then you can end up recreating them under the AF. So you still have to look to the tangible impacts. With that, let's move on to pandemics. Their third response about the CDC is still going to take out their turns about fear of the police and etc. Because if there's still other health surveillance that's going to solve back, then all of these enforcement measures are still going to be used. They just say that it's better than the NSA. However, the NSA's phone records are still as good because they're still looking at browsing records. For example, they can find out which people are searching up symptoms online at the early stages, which is why you don't even need to rely on this law enforcement either way. So these aren't mutually exclusive ways to combat pandemics. On terrorism, first on overload, McCloskey 20 explains that right now the NSA is actually developing these algorithms that are self-supervising and can actually train back and curb overload, which is why in the end, overload is not going to be a long-term issue. They can decrease the actual amount of overload and isolate exactly which information is more important. But then you can group their second and third responses. We had saying that even if you have rhetoric, our argument is still that first, the focus is shifting to counter because the government is considering right-wing extremism as a threat. That's why we were preventing the coordination, communication, and increased radicalization of these white supremacists in the first place, which links into this argument about rhetoric. But second, we'd also say that this is something that's going to be more recent because after the inauguration, that means that Biden is more likely to focus on things like far-right extremism after the attack on the Capitol, etc. But then that also responds to the fourth one because once again, if the focus is shifting to counter, then that means that the government is still going to try to preempt these attacks, and they have the mechanisms with the NSA. On cyber, we'll agree, we'll just concede all of the impact defense. That doesn't matter in the round. Let's move to their case. At the top, First, they talk about how algorithms are really bad. However, first, data is always going to exist. They can use existing data right now in their already databases. And then second, Valentino 19 explains that, for example, the FBI gets data from a wide array of companies anyways, including usernames, locations, IP addresses, and records of purchases. Third, their evidence is more specific to the DEA and doesn't really talk exactly what, quote, law enforcement means. But Wilson actually explains that the DEA's surveillance predated the NSA and is basically able to surveil 85% of the US population anyways. And fourth, Quet 20 of The Intercept reveals that big tech companies like Google are giving precincts surveillance technology to conduct this surveillance locally. This is important because, for example, their second link is specific to social media. But then you can turn this argument. Algorithms have more precision. Siegel articulates that algorithms are far more precise and unbiased as opposed to the broader targeting of police. If anything, if you have a larger data set with the NSA's metadata, that means that it's better to actually train the AI, and that means that the AI that's developed in the app world would be significantly more biased because it will rely on smaller, more racist databases. On their specific link, first on helping the police. First, we'd say the NSA data is not key. Their link evidence is speculative and it's from 2014. We'd say there's increased transparency post-Snowden, especially because right now there have been steps to increase privacy under Biden. But second, the FBI doesn't use NSA data for crime. They can do this with any other data, especially when it comes to things like mass incarceration in which racism is perpetuated. The crimes that they're trying to prevent, like petty theft, wouldn't make them use NSA data. They use that for things like terror cells or gang actions. Otherwise, it'd be too much effort to parse through all the info. Then third, you can turn it. The state will always find worse ways to incriminate minorities. Gibbons explains that instead of arresting specific people, police will carry out wide crackdowns on entire communities based on weaker human intel to fill the gap left by surveillance. This affects communities of color much worse on scope and magnitude because it targets everyone in the community. And Schwartz 19 writes that the alternative is that we're relying on human intelligence, which is far more racially biased. For example, they're basing off of what they can visually see, like things like skin color, and can also increase police encounters. On disrupting policeful protests. First, we'd say that the link evidence, none of it is NSA specific. It just says that social media posts are where the government can target things. But SCNL 15 and their own author Kayali actually explains that during the civil rights movement, it was the FBI program COINTELPRO that targeted MLK and the Black Panther Party, and the DHS has been the one that's tracking BLM since 2014, not the NSA. But then second, we'd say that if anything, the FBI and CIA would have a lot more autonomy for data collection under the affirmative world. Lewis Schwartz explains that broad surveillance of communications is the least intrusive and most effective method for security, which is why during other movements, human intel actually involved sending blackmail or trying to physically break up these parties, all of which are still considered violent and perpetuate structural racism. Any cards? Because I didn't go exactly off my speech doc, so I don't know if...
Okay, yeah, I'll just call for the couple that I need then. Can I get, oh shoot. The very first response you had about how data is inevitable, was that just an analytic?
There were... Okay, I read three of the 4 examples were carded, but they're different cards. There's FBI, DEA, and then big tech companies like Google.
Yeah. Can I get all of those?
Okay.
Yeah, the cards. Which cards in our case, say DEA, that you were indicting?
I think it was Kayali and Balco.
Kayali and Balco. Okay.
I was looking at the original article for those 2. Any others than those 3?
Can I also get the Gibbons and Schwartz of... Actually, can I also just get all the cards on predictive policing, actually?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, I just sent them all. There are 5 in total. And I can give the order if you'd like.
No, I don't think I need the order. I just wanted to see them, yeah. I'll tell you when I get them, though, and then we can start cross.
Sure.
I think I just got it. Lauren, do you want to take some prep before cross? Okay, cool. We've used 50 seconds exactly. Give me a sec to start a timer.
Hold on, I didn't get it yet.
Oh.
Oh, it went to my junk. I lied. All right.
Okay, cool. We'll start now. We're stopping prep. That was 1 minute used, so we have 110 left. I'm good for cross.
Yep, just getting my timer. I'm good whenever.
Okay, cool. Can I have first question?
Of course.
Sure. So on like terrorism or whatever, you told me that like they're shifting towards fighting terrorism now. I guess my question is like the NSA already was monitoring white supremacists like before the Capitol attack. Like they knew they were going to attack. They had the data saying they were going to attack, and yet the day it happens, they just pretty much let them inside the Capitol and do whatever the heck they want. What changes in the future that like we're actually going to be stopping white supremacists if they literally already have the data right now?
So first, we'd say that the Capitol attack has brought attention to the lack of like response, which is why the government would have learned their lesson. But second, we'd also say that even if they have some data beforehand, it's not necessarily that they had all the data and had tracked all of the analysis that you need to do in order to.
Well, no, because like they were like posting on like public forums. Like they would like go on like Twitter, be like, "Hey guys, we're gonna invade the Capitol." Like it wasn't like through the dark web. Like it was like public information. Like people were like telling the government, like, "Hey, y'all should watch out for this."
So why is this connected to the NSA? Because
Yeah, like,
we have evidence that says that the government is already taking proactive measures to prevent the next attack since they have learned their lesson after this one.
okay. I mean, that's just like empirical. Like there have been so many attacks like the past couple of months, like just in like different states around the country. But that's fine. You can have a question.
They haven't all had the exact same media attention or been considered to be like the same degree of severity as this attack has been. Sure. So I wanted to ask, so if we were to end the NSA, then what would police be using instead?
Not and racist NSA data.
So what data would they be using?
I don't know. Like they'd probably maybe they rely on like some local police data, but we say that's still uniquely better because of the fact that when you have this massive NSA database that becomes more biased over time. We'll like explain to you why more in summary, but like basically our O'Donnell evidence is very explicit in saying because the NSA causes the over policing of certain neighborhoods, at least you getting only data on those neighborhoods, which leads you over police them even more and creates a constant feedback loop of over policing.
The thing is, it's not the NSA solely that just drives the issue of over-policing. Like, the over-policing, although the information from the various government agencies can lead to over-policing, it's not like it's a sole symptom of the NSA's work. Over-policing can happen with basically any kind of data that you have.
Well, no, we'd say it's specific to the NSA because every agency uses the NSA. Even if you say that like there's some big tech agencies that can fill in, like some local law enforcement agencies have the capabilities, we say most don't. And even if they do, it's actually the same scale. Can I have a question?
Why don't they have those capabilities?
What do you mean? Like local law enforcement agencies just don't have the capital, like the resources to make such a big database that would be able to like look through all this data.
They don't make a big database in order to over-police communities of color.
Well, if you don't necessarily know who you're targeting, like the problem with the NSA is they know specific areas. They said like you need to go to this area because black people show up here often. Local police enforcement agencies don't have the capabilities to do so like the NSA does across the entire country.
That's
which means they're still protecting black people.
Does that they would end up doing broad-based crackdowns on communities of color? Like
but they don't know where to go. Like it's like you're giving
demographic information that they can use.
That's different though. It's like you're telling racist people specifically where to go to catch black people, whereas just leaving the racist people by themselves, I'd say that's still better.
We're just saying that racist people would find other forms of racist data, which could arguably be worse. But yeah.
Okay. We're gonna take some more prep. We have 110 left. We'll start now.
Okay. It's just gonna go our case, their case. Our case, yeah, our case frontlining, rule of the ballot, their case. Let me pull up my speech. Okay. Hold on, let me reorganize something.
Sorry, I like zoned out. Where are you starting?
I'm starting on our case, and then I'm just gonna go to roll of the ballot and then your case.
Okay.
So it's like kind of straight down. Okay, sorry. Computer is not working right. Okay. Let's start off on our case. We're in for our second link. The NSA uses Marina to collect info on individuals, which are given to police for predictive policing, which creates a feedback loop, which leads to Black people being targeted by police. That's Davies and who. We tell you that the NSA algorithms are over police Black neighborhoods, which results in 1,000 Black people being shot annually. This only ends when you end NSA surveillance. That's the Washington Post. But when we're weighing, Blackness comes first as a center discourse around discussion around Blackness, while their role of the ballot only centers conversation around the impact of the ballot, which means that when you leave this round, no one will continue to talk discourse on the impact of the ballot. While when you make Blackness center the conversation, real reform will be made. Let's go into what they say. They give you first response saying data will always exist. No, they need constant new data to actually build cases on specific people and specificity. But then the second and third response, you can group them on FBI and data going to DEA. All the evidence is very specific and saying that the NSA gives this data to DEA and FBI. And then this way they say DEA has 85% of surveillance. It doesn't matter if DEA has surveillance. Their algorithms aren't the same as the NSA, which means they aren't as racist, which means they don't create the same feedback loops. They aren't interacting with their actual links. But then they say big tech gives the data first. Their card's only about Google and facial recognition are just algorithms, not the same thing. But these Google's only given to a few police departments. Is not the same thing as giving them to every police department in the country like the NSA is doing. But then say you could turn it because algorithms are unbiased and they're gonna get better. But and Anderson 15 tells you they have worked to algorithms won't get better because they've worked to maintain white supremacy through brutality and blunt force. They are tasked with subjugating Black people and social predators to what will inevitably be waged against Black people. Black people will always be policed in new innovative ways with that secure tradition of oppression via a state, which means that as long as you have these algorithms in place, they're always going to get worse and not better. Is what you're seeing in the status quo. But then they say that on policing, that NSA data is not increasing transparency, but transparency can't increase because there's too much data to actually look through. That's why oversight committees don't actually work. When they say FBI doesn't use this data for criminals, we say our evidence is very specific. And the NSA gives this data to FBI, but even if the FBI still exists and does surveillance, we say that one less racist program is still better than two. Then third, they say you could turn it because it's better than human intelligence. But this is the problem. Algorithms actually feed into human intelligence. When you have these racist algorithms saying that Black people are committing crimes and they're the ones who you should target, then human intelligence is always going to be affected. That's why it's always worse. We're not going to go for our second contention. Our second link. There's actually no impact links there. So going to the role of the ballot really quickly. Remember the role of the ballot discourse around surveillance has always been seen through the lens of whiteness, which is always justified oppressing minorities. That's Weller. You must look at the surveillance through the lens of Blackness and indiscriminatory Jim Crow surveillance for the status quo. That's Brown. At the point where they drop our role of the ballot and only just give their role of the ballot, there's no interaction. Remember, their role of the ballot, both of our roles of ballot are post-fiat. They're just talking about impacts. Remember, impacts always don't actually have the discussion around like the center discourse of surveillance is why you have to look at our conversation, because when you end the NSA, you're actually ending the harmful impacts of killing Black people by over policing. That's what they're not interacting with. Let's go to the second contention. Specifically, remember this extension has no impact at all on Black people. When you say the NSA was built to protect white supremacy, that's why Kumar tells you that it can never actually be used against white supremacists because it's always built to protect them. Let's look at like Charlottesville and the riots at the Capitol. Those are both reactionary. They had the info before, but they didn't stop either of those attacks. This is why you tell you that like I mean, that Biden actually can't solve anything because Biden's only gonna gives more power to local police enforcement, which means they're gonna make them more racist. The only way to solve is actually ending the NSA surveillance and making them less racist.
Jen, is there any evidence you want?
No, I like cut out for the last 5 seconds. Was there anything like?
It was just Biden only gives more power to local law enforcement.
Okay. Okay. It's gonna start on the roll of the ballot. And then I'm gonna do turns on their case first. On the roll of the ballot, it's pretty clear they're both linking to tangible impacts, but the difference is they only talk about having a lot of discourse, but not only do we have discourse, because all of our impacts are also centralized on a discussion about Blackness, but we also talk about the most tangible impacts at the end of the day. So that's what you should be evaluating in this round. On their case, a few responses. First, the DA surveillance predates the NSA. That means absent the NSA, there's still a lot of surveillance. They just say that it's not as bad. There's no warranting done on this at all. Instead, we say that these were built on the same exact racial structures. The difference is the second or one of the responses that Karina Rezagos dropped. It is that absent the NSA, like there can still be algorithms built off of existing data. The difference is when there's more data, you can actually correct those structures. There's also no warranting done on their frontline here. They just say it doesn't get better because of structural issues. Those issues can change. There can be reforms done to the process of the NSA, but the difference is you need a massive amount of data in order to correct the racial data that was collected in the past. But the second response is the one that they completely mishandle. It is that absent the NSA, police will do huge community crackdowns because they don't have specific surveillance on individuals. That is why we outweigh on scope and magnitude, because you cracked on an A, huge population, but B, using human intelligence and using more physical forces in order to do these crackdowns in the first place. Their only response to this argument is that surveillance feeds in. But the problem is that they missed Karina's first response. Absent the NSA, all of these programs still have old data. That means they can always do like crackdowns and than human intelligence and use all of those forces without NSA data. But the difference is when you have more data, you actually have the ability to train AI better in order to like not be as racist like they are in the status quo. But at the very end, they drop a huge turn on their second argument, which also feeds into the role of the bad. It is the idea that targeted surveillance is more racial. Absent the NSA, which has mass surveillance is collecting data on every single individual, regardless of who they are. In comparison, when you look to things like the FBI and CIA, they do racial surveillance targeting, which means they collect more information on Black people, which leads to more crackdowns in the regions. That is why there's a trade-off. When you vote for the AF, you lead to an increase in things like the FBI, which A, is a lot more intrusive, and B, is a lot more physical in their crackdowns of Black communities, which is why comparatively the NSA, which has mass surveillance, is much, much better. Let's go to our case. At the top, we say that right now, the NSA is able to use their massive amounts of data to crack down on domestic terrorism, specifically white nationalism. Our uniqueness is that right now, there's a trend towards countering that. That is why after the Capitol attack, people actually started looking to proactive measures to prevent this from happening in the future. She reads your responses. First, it says that these systems are built to protect white people, but there's no warranting done here as to why these systems cannot change. We give you the warranting is that there's a public perception shift, and Biden's actually building his campaign on improving these structures and making them less racist, which is why we actually have a way to step back. But the second response actually loses them the round. She says that Biden is going to switch to more localized and give more money to local police forces. But that means absent the NSA, he's going to feed more money into these local police forces. The warranting here is that when there's a perception of a decreased security, there's an increase in police budgets, which are a lot more forceful and use a lot more violence to crack down physically on Black communities.
You good for Gran?
Yep.
All right. Can I have first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So, I'll give me like 2 seconds. All right. You say that like local police officers crack down on people, and it's like it's worse because they have old data. I guess like my question is simply like we've read you evidence that says the data never gets better because it creates the constant feedback loop. That's the O'Donnell evidence that never goes to respond to. It says that the data over polices Black neighborhoods, which leads to you getting more data on Black neighborhoods, which leads to you over policing them over and over again. Where are the reforms you talk about specifically for data? You might tell me that Biden is going to read from local police agencies, but where's the reforming the racist data?
Okay, so the difference is when you compare targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. So when you have targeted surveillance, there is a feedback loop because you continuously target.
No, but like what my question is, what's the difference making the mass surveillance right now not racist? Because you can't win any offense if the targeted surveillance is the same thing, just on a lesser scale.
No, so our argument is that when you collect massive amounts of data on every single individual, regardless of who they are, it corrects back for the targeted surveillance. It doesn't.
Like, that's the O'Donnell evidence that says the reason why it doesn't do so is because it disproportionately affects Black neighborhoods. Like, that's the status quo.
No, what is the warranting there?
No, because you over-police Black neighborhoods. That's what they're doing right now, right? Which means you get more data on Black neighborhoods. You might say there's more data, but it's just more data on Black people.
Yeah, that's the same thing as targeted surveillance. But comparatively, when you have mass surveillance, you also collect data on other individuals.
No, that is the mass surveillance, but it's just it disproportionately is hurting Black people. So it's already targeted.
What Jen's trying to get at right now is that the alternative when you vote for the AF is not to just have no data at all to feed into these feedback loops. It's that you still have targeted surveillance, which is going to be even more racially targeted, which still creates these feedback loops.
On these targeted surveillance, you say it's the FBI and CIA, right?
Sure, or local.
Right, you never interact with our frontline. Would you give you in summary is that the FBI, CIA, all these other programs get it from the NSA.
So
if they rely on the NSA, I'm sorry, you don't answer in second summary. We're telling you that what we tell you is that in first summary is that they get all the data from the NSA, which means that absent the NSA, they can't do this own surveillance.
No, I literally answered in summary. I say that absent the NSA, you can use old data. So they don't use the new data.
The response to that is that you need constant data to do this constant surveillance. This is why our whole link chain is that you have this surveillance, this new surveillance to build specific cases around people, and you can't do that with old surveillance because it's already been used.
Right, so what Jen was contesting is the idea that you can only do police crackdowns based off of new data. If you have old data based off of demographics or what regions have higher, quote, crime rates, then they can still use that exact same thing to get police intervention. So
right.
Saying that the alternative,
if police don't know where to go or who to target, then how can they arrest these people?
That's exactly what Gibbons says. Broad-based crackdowns on communities of color instead of just maybe one person that posted something online.
Okay, out of curiosity, still getting rid of a very racist structure like the NSA and a racist government program. How does why isn't that a reason to negate? Sure, police can still be racist and do crackdowns. We're not solving for all racism. Why is that a reason to negate?
Okay, so the warranting that I do in summary is there is a trade-off. Absent the NSA, there's an increase of targeted surveillance in comparison to mass surveillance. That targeted surveillance, like the FBI and CIA and like the DEA,
Right.
who also did mass surveillance, can still share that data with local police forces.
I understand
So
that you could do more targeted surveillance, but at the point where the targeted surveillance that the FBI and DEA does is reliant on the NSA, how can they do that?
But it's not reliant. They just
Well,
have their own information. There's like no warranty
for evidence to say that it's reliant on the NSA.
It's the Kaoli
That's not what
evidence
it
and
says.
there are more cards, but I think we're over time.
All right. I don't think we have prep left. It's just gonna be our case weighing their case. Is everyone good? Okay. Sorry, give me a sec to pull this up. All right, cool. So at the top of our case, the NSA uses Marina to collect info on individuals who are given to police for predictive policing, which is a constant feedback loop that goes into black people being targeted by police. That's Davies and Hugh. We're going for our first thing on predictive policing. The NSA algorithms overpolice black neighborhoods, which leads to 1,000 black people being killed, shot by police annually. This only ends when you NSA surveillance. That's the Washington Post. They read you a couple terms. I'll answer all of them now. First, they say that it's built on these same structures, which is built on existing data, so it doesn't change. But the problem is, if you don't have these continuous updates of the racist data the NSA does, it doesn't get worse. The O'Donnell evidence tells you that it creates a constant feedback loop. They are trying to rely on reforms that will literally never happen. To make them prove that somehow the NSA's racist data system are going to reform. Oh wait, they can't, because that's never going to happen. But second, we'd also just tell you that like it's going to end the world that it only changes when you end the mass surveillance of black people. It's going to happen on a mass scale. That's not better. Secondly, they say that crackdowns are worse because it's like on scope. No, this argument doesn't make any sense. Indeed, what the O'Donnell evidence again tells you that the NSA's racist data is specifically used to target black people in the status quo. It's net better to give the racist people less racist data so they can't target black people as much. But then second, we just tell you that the CIA and FBI literally rely on the NSA right now, which means there's no chance for them to fill in the same scale or be as worse. They just say that, oh, there's going to be a fill-in. The problem is there's really no warrant or evidence why there'd be a fill-in. Like, sure, the NSA ends. That doesn't mean the CIA just like jacks up surveillance on black people. We would tell you they don't get the same intelligence they do to local law enforcement that actually takes out the racist thing that they have in the status quo. But third, they say that targeted is worse. Remember again, first, the mass surveillance is a lot worse because on a lot bigger scale, and the data is racist. They try and portray the fact that like, oh, mass surveillance is better because it's less targeted. The problem is it's constantly targeting black people, which means there's never any change. But second, we tell you that like the school is literally having targeting status quo, which means there's never any change. But third, there's no capabilities for fill-in. On your roll of the ballots, remember, we're winning that the capabilities, the status quo is uniquely bad for black people, is uniquely harmful for them, which means any sort of change to reject that system is uniquely good. They can't win that somehow the future is going to be better because these racist systems are never going to update, which means the status quo, like the affirmative, is the only way to actually end the NSA's racist system. That's why we prefer our case over theirs. Let's go into their case. Two reasons why they lose the round. First, the Kumar evidence pretty much those never responded to. None of the systems are actually used to harm black or like to target white people. We'd say it's always used to target black people. They just say like, oh, Biden's making reforms. The problem is Biden's reforms aren't working. He just wants to give more money to local police informers. The reason why this doesn't take our case is because of the fact that sure, he might be giving more money to local police departments, but in the world they rely on NSA data, they can't use that data. It's not going to be used to target black people anymore if they have more money. We're the only way to actually end the racist system, which is why you must actually affirm.
I'm going to start on our case and then go to their. Oh, actually, no. Sorry. I meant start on their case, then go to ours. Is anybody not ready? Okay. Time starts now. At the end of the round, it's easy to vote for us off of the two turns on their case. They're severely mishandled or just responded to in first final focus. So first, we're talking about how the alternative to having the NSA's data is to do a lot of broad-based crackdowns. All they say is that you need updated data. This simply is not true. Old data about like previous police encounters is enough to drive policemen to continue to increase their encounters or intervene in communities of color, which is why Gibbons explains that instead you'd have broad-based crackdowns on communities, which as Jen extends is going to outweigh on scope and magnitude. You're actually encountering a lot more POC when you do that. But then second, they talk about these feedback loops that are going to be perpetuated by the NSA. Once again, this is the better than the alternative, which is to have targeted surveillance, continuing to perpetuate these feedback loops as well. Insofar as the FBI and the CIA are still the ones that are doing the targeted human intelligence gathering as well, then this never gets better under the affirmative world, which is a reason to vote for the neg, because if anything, once we're telling you that the police encounters would be going up severely under the affirmative world. Then, on the FBI and CIA, they basically just say that these are reliant on the NSA. The evidence does not say that they are reliant on it, just that the NSA's information is sometimes given to them. However, that just means that the FBI and CIA have alternative forms of information that they still use or feed to local police to increase these encounters. Or if they're using human intelligence, remember what Jen tells you, which is that this increases these police encounters or actually have physical violent methods. They just say that there's no warrant for this fill-in. This is entirely new in final focus when we extend it straight from rebuttal. However, historically, as we have told you, the CIA or the FBI has been the one to actually like target these target civil rights movements in the past, there's no reason why they wouldn't do this, especially if they have the incentive to, if government is racist. Then the reason to vote for the neg is if AF makes it worse, then clearly that means that you want to keep the status quo, even if the status quo doesn't necessarily mean you're reforming now. Then on our case, what we're saying is that the change is still possible, because what we're saying is, first, after the Capitol attack, Biden is still going to be increasing the attention on proactively preventing these attacks, and second, it was part of his campaign. But then specifically on the police budgets, if Biden is truly going to be increasing these police forces, then that's just a reason to continue to have the NSA's data, which is going to be, because the perception of the decreased security after the NSA goes down means that in anything, these budgets are going to go up. Instead, the comparative between mass surveillance or these local police budgets, and we'd say that the mass surveillance, which isn't just targeting the POC, is always going to be better. Good round, y'all.
Good round.
Good
Thank
round.
y'all for judging.
Yes, thank you all for judging.